Dr. Ahmed Zaidi has a super interesting story. After missing out on getting into medical school, he studied computer science, later completing his PhD at Cambridge. As a student, he launched his own health AI startup, which diagnosed rashes on intimate body parts. This didn't quite work out though, and he pivoted and launched a data AI company called Catalyst AI. This company would later go on to be acquired by Farfetch, the luxury online fashion retail platform, to help optimize their fashion supply chains. He now sits on the Prime Minister of Pakistan's Science and Technology Task Force, on the Development Council of the Woolf Institute, and is the co-founder of a sustainable fashion enterprise. We speak about the unlikely overlaps between fashion and health tech. No, seriously, there's lots of overlap. We speak about how to find your ultimate purpose and how, when building relationships, the ultimate form of self-serving is being a giver. I hope you enjoy.
I love to build stuff. I hated consulting. So I immediately eliminated Accenture as an option for a career choice. So when I came back to university that final year, me and a couple of friends got together and decided to build our first product. And we thought a lot about the product. And I know it sounds silly, but we decided that we were going to start a product that would classify rashes on intimate body parts. So that was the actual idea we had. Now, the problem was that you needed to collect a data set. So somebody, poor man, had to go on Google and type in rashes on your scrotum, which became, a very difficult task to do. And then very quickly, we started coming across different regulatory hurdles about how do we actually validate this tool? Is it a decision support tool, or is it how do we make sure we don't get sued when we give someone the wrong classification for a disease or for a rash?
Why did you do intimate body parts versus just skin in general?
I think one of the friends that we had described his personal experience about how he was really worried about a particular rash on his body. And he's like, oh, wouldn't it be so great if you could just take a photo of that part and you don't have to show it to a human being. You could show it to your phone and it would tell you what it is. Very valid concern, right? Made complete sense at the time, but it turns out that it's much harder to actually implement and execute something like that. Especially we're talking 2013 when machine learning was just becoming a thing. Deep learning was just becoming a thing. It wasn't even a thing yet. In the way that it became later on. And there was no idea of how to regulate these sorts of things. So to actually get CE approval and be able to use it in practice was a far-fetched reality. So we very quickly sort of dropped the idea. And then I went on to pursue a master's at Cambridge. So I did a master's in computer science where I focused on machine learning because I had a taster, modeling scrotum rashes. So I was like, you know what, this sounds really great. I'm going to continue it. Changed my focus a little bit though. It was more on education. I think I had that itch for entrepreneurship when I was younger as well, because I liked building stuff. I didn't necessarily know how to sell. I had done a couple of internships in investment banking where I got a taster of how to sell, but I still liked this idea of building stuff. So in my MPhil, because it was so intense, I had decided strategically I need to focus and not deviate to try to build any tools or products. And it wasn't until the start of my PhD that I decided to really full on explore the idea of entrepreneurship. I had actually gotten into this program called Entrepreneur First, and I'd also got a scholarship to do a PhD at Cambridge. And I was very much sure that I wanted to do the Entrepreneur First. But my mom did her istikhara, the sort of the voodoo stuff that you open the Quran and you basically figure out whether or not it's a good thing for you to do or not. She ended up saying, no, it's good for you to do the PhD. So I started the PhD, immediately felt this isn't enough for me. I need to do something else. So I decided to start a company. And the way that happened was I went to an event where there were people who had the same scholarship as me. I got the Cambridge International Trust Scholarship, and other Cambridge International Trust scholars were there at this event. And I met a guy there who then became my co-founder later on, Ray, who had just sold his old company and had come to Cambridge to pursue his master's. And, we dated and had coffee a few times and decided that, we liked each other enough to start something together. So we started a consultancy called Catalyst AI. And our role was to solve business problems for large enterprises using machine learning. And that was how we started.
And then can you talk about how that hit the next level? And what happened next?
We explored a lot of different industries, and we started to think about what our unfair advantage was. Like, what is our competitive edge? What do we know that other people don't know? For a while, we thought it was finance because I had done like one internship for 3 months in investment banking. Turns out that's not that much experience, but we had quite a few people in the healthcare space or working in the healthcare space, not necessarily medical doctors. And the other advantage I had is that everyone I knew was a doctor. Like all of my friends, as I mentioned earlier, went on to become doctors, and I had unlimited customer reviews and customer feedback through my network of family friends. So I decided, why not go down this route where we think that we can actually have an advantage. So what we did is we took the existing research of the people on our team. One of the members of our team was using computer vision to identify diabetes retinopathy and glaucoma in using OCT scan, which was really in at the time because Google DeepMind had just signed a deal with Moorfields. So we wanted to see if we could productize that. So we started working on that. Another one of my friends was doing machine learning analysis on Medulloblastoma, which was looking at how we can have non-invasive methods of identifying benign tumors so that they don't have to unnecessarily dig in and get a biopsy for children, and it's incredibly painful. So we're looking at ways of doing that. Similar thing for research that he had done previously with mammograms and looking at like calcification around breast tumors and finding non-invasive ways of identifying that. So we had really clear case studies and research that was quite advanced to be able to start productizing that. So we started, mapping this out and pitching it to different hospital groups. We had a chat with various directors of digital in a variety of different hospitals all across the country to identify whether or not there was appetite for something like this. And for whatever reason, it turned out it was much more difficult for us to break through into the healthcare system than we expected. And that the amount of funding that we would need to develop a product, like they weren't interested in simply holding clinical trials. They were interested, you would need the backing of a university to do that. They were interested in you getting CE approval before you even step foot into the hospital, unless it's a research hospital that's co-developed it with you. So the procurement process of these hospitals was incredibly complicated. And the challenge was that the people we were pitching to were not computer scientists. So the director of digital for Addenbrooke's was a, consultant anesthesiologist. And we were trying to explain to him how a machine learning algorithm works and why he should think about incorporating that into his workflow. So it became a very complicated process of, figuring out and speaking different languages. Even though we had, brought in doctors to communicate the specifics of the product, there's a significant issue. And I think this issue still exists today, is that the head of procurement is usually a doctor. It's usually a well-intentioned doctor who is volunteering or being paid for part of their time to, lead the procurement process for, a digital product procurement, which creates a lot of complexities for innovators coming into the system. I think now there is, with NHS Digital, with lots of people moving into the NHS space, there's a considerable amount of talent and people, facilitating this process, but there's still a significant need to improve that.
So what happened next? And I think this is somewhere where the email comes in.
Yeah. So something happened before then. So I was giving a talk here in Cambridge, and the other people who were giving a talk, either with me or before me, were Mustafa Suleiman, so one of the co-founders of DeepMind, and a chap named Paul Grayson, who ran this company called Sensine Health out of Oxford. We got chatting after the talk, and he invited me up to Oxford to have a chat, and said, take a blank piece of paper and have a think about what you want for your team. So, we got super excited, immediately got to work thinking about, hey, maybe this is an acquisition deal. It's more of an acqui-hire because they want our team. So we started to put together a pitch of, what we're valued at and what we think we're worth and what we bring to the table. And for a combination of reasons that I can't actually publicly speak about, the deal fell through. And it's interesting how when there's money and tangible money on the table, how the perspectives and the self-worth of people evolve. So that was a very challenging time for us as a team. I made lots of mistakes. There were lots of challenges around, I deserve more equity, you deserve less equity, because now there's a dollar value associated with that equity. So that was a very challenging time. And when that fell through, it's not like those issues just disappeared. Those issues continue to linger. But then we sort of got saved by an email because we needed a new focus as a team. We needed to find a way to move forward. And one day I was clearing through our info@catalystlab.ai email. It's an email that no one ever checks, because no one would ever think anyone would email on that email. We weren't like so well known that people would be sending us emails there. And it was an email from Burberry. And they were very interested in having a chat with us, which was completely absurd. I thought it was a spam email. But I replied anyway. I said, sure, happy to have a chat. And, before you know it, we were pitching to Burberry and, managed to secure our first project in the fashion industry. And it was only then that we started to really understand how much value there was in data science and AI and the application of those tools in the fashion world, and the willingness to pay. So more importantly, the willingness to pay for those solutions. And once we identified that, we managed to make lots of progress in securing more clients, partnering up with other consultancies to jointly pitch to bigger groups. Flew to New York to pitch to PVH, which is the group that owns Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein. And it was sort of, a serendipitous moment, completely unexpected, that changed the trajectory of my career, to be honest.
Can you talk about what happens next, but maybe layer in some of the learnings or similarities you found between originally starting off in health tech and data science and then transitioning to fashion tech? And were there any commonalities within those two approaches?
So as we started to explore work in the fashion industry, we were working on what's called last mile optimization. So that's looking at once a product has been produced, once the garment has been produced, what stores do you put it? How do you price it? How do you discount it to get it out? And after doing that for a while, I started to feel like I wasn't really making an impact in the way that I wanted to. Sure, we could make a viable business out of it, and we were, but it wasn't really moving the needle in terms of making an impact in the industry. And what I realized was that the actual root problem of the industry was upstream, was the factories, working with the factories, what orders you place in the first place. So we were mitigating the mistakes that brands had made earlier on. So I thought, why not look towards that route to tackle this problem? We can skip, there's a variety of things that happen afterwards. So, I had this idea in my head. It was a seed. I hadn't really explored it. But, I was doing my PhD still, and I was going through some personal issues in my life at the time, which meant that I needed to take a break from the business that I was running. And I need to focus on all of my cognitive energy on finishing my PhD. So I had a very difficult conversation with my co-founder, and I said, look, I need to take a break. And, we decided that if I wasn't running the business, then perhaps nobody should be running the business. Perhaps we should shut the business down. We started, winding the business down when, one of the clients that we were working with offered to acquire us. So we got acquired, and, very fortunate for us in a way that, benefited all of the members of the team, including myself. And then off the back of that, I was appointed as an advisor for this company. The company's called Farfetch. They sell like luxury goods, luxury fashion goods. And that gave me some time to really reflect on what I wanted to do next. And that seed that I planted earlier about looking upstream became a reality and became something I had more time for. So I started looking into it. And that's where I feel like you can draw a lot of parallels between what we saw in the healthcare industry and what we saw in the fashion industry. For one, just like the healthcare industry, the fashion industry is heavily reliant on human resources. If you ever go to a factory in Vietnam, or even in Portugal, or even in the US for that matter, there are certain functions that only humans can do. The cut and sew of an item is such a technical craft that even today, even robots cannot do it the same way as humans. The angles that you need to do, the intuition you need to have, we're just not at that level yet. potentially in the future we'll be able to get there, but at the moment it's still very, manual and human resource intensive. And that's something that, is very similar to the healthcare industry. But a second, I think, more important point is that fashion, like healthcare, is a very personal thing. Everyone has different needs. Everyone has different tastes. Yet a brand needs to be very cohesive and very clear on its mission. Similar way that the NHS has to have a very clear mission about what they want to do. Every individual person has a different medical requirement, difficult medical needs. And I think that those similar issues exist in fashion. Fashion businesses are trying to be synchronized, trying to be aligned, but it's very difficult when it's so personal and everyone wants different things.
Can I draw another analogy, which is that just how public health officials or virologists will look to the future and try and predict which strains of viruses will be prevalent and maybe create vaccines or maybe put some public health measures in place to get ahead of that. The thing I find fascinating about fashion is that a 30-year-old brown guy has the job of working out what 15-year-old white girls in the UK will find fashionable next season, right? And you need to have made it before the season starts. So do you have any kind of insights on how you do that in fashion? Like how do you work out what's going to be cool?
I think one thing that, the pandemic has taught us is that nobody knows what the future holds. Virologists did their best to figure out how the virus was going to evolve and how it was going to affect our lives and, the implications of it. And, more often than not, they were wrong, right? And I think in a similar vein, as a 30-year-old brown dude, I'm not pretending to, know what 15-year-old girls want, because I actually think this is the fundamental difference between me and somebody who is an industry veteran. I don't think we should predict the future. I think we should react to what's happening. You test the market and you react to what works and what doesn't. I'm much more of the view of planning in shorter terms. So, some people during the pandemic were saying, let's plan for the next 6 weeks, right? We don't know what's going to happen in 2 months. Let's plan for the next 6 weeks. What are the policies we're going to have in the next 6 weeks to mitigate this risk? That's the same way I think the fashion industry needs to operate. And this is like a very different topic, but, stop trying to predict what's going to happen in a year from now. And that's what fashion companies are doing. Just plan for the next 6 weeks and make sure that your processes are aligned in a way that, help you do that.
One other parallel I wanted to talk about between health and fashion was that there's this, false dichotomy of the emotional brain and the logical brain. And I think it's pretty well understood now that you can have all the information in the world, or a patient can have all the information in the world about, say, smoking, alcohol, whatever, and they can fully understand that, but they still might not adapt their behaviors or change their behaviors. So, for example, you see lots of doctors who smoke or lots of doctors who eat tons of fast food, et cetera, et cetera. I think in fashion, there's almost an understanding that you are somewhat using your more primal or emotional brain. Like, what is a brand? It's just this kind of intangible aura created by a company, and you pay a premium to access that. So it's kind of understood, right? The question I wanted to ask was that I've seen a lot of wellness, fitness type companies now, like Aura, Whoop, Peloton. And the thing I keep on noticing about them is that they're super cool. So in the terms of their Apple-esque design or their celebrity endorsements, there's just a cool vibe about them. And when I was thinking the other day, like maybe I'll buy an Aura ring, and I don't really have a need for it, but I was just thinking I would look cool having that. And I think that's a big driving force behind it. So I just wanted to kind of generally ask your thoughts on that, but also just ask you if you, through your insight into the fashion world, have you picked up some gleanings on like what makes something cool or how you maybe sell a cool lifestyle to people? Do you know what I mean? Has anything like that come into your mind?
Yeah. I mean, I think the psychology of a brand is a really important topic to dissect in general, because it comes back to our primal, as you mentioned, our primal instincts to be part of a tribe, to be part of a group, to feel like we belong. And, you have the nonconformists, but actually the nonconformists themselves are a tribe of the nonconformists, so like everyone is tribal in nature. And I think that brands that successfully identify their tribe have the ability to transcend, utilitarian value. If you look at the way, there was a really interesting experiment that was done on Apple users versus Samsung users. And they found that like when Apple users were shown an Apple product, they had a positive sympathetic response, right? And a sympathetic response towards Apple. But when they were shown Samsung, they just had a neutral response. Like, no, like they're indifferent to Samsung. In a similar case, they showed the Samsung users an Apple product and they had a negative response. They hated Apple. But when they were shown a Samsung phone, they just had a neutral response. So that goes to show that like Samsung users don't love Samsung. They just hate Apple, and there's this interesting dichotomy of branding that's been able to create a tribe that is anti-Apple. The tribe that's Android is not pro-Android. It's just anti-Apple because they think Apple is elitist. It stands for something that they don't agree with. And I think that transcends logic. That transcends, even your wallet. In some cases, people are buying stuff they can't afford. And it's definitely something that, the fashion industry is built on. Clothes are all made of similar material. The only difference is, okay, fine, you can say that there's some level of quality difference, but is there like $3,000 worth of quality difference between, an H&M product and a Louis Vuitton product? Probably not. That value is in what it means to be part of the tribe of Louis Vuitton. Why do people die for getting a Birkin bag, which is like, almost $100,000? It's being part of a club. It's like, oh, I'm exclusive. Why do people want to be part of Soho House? It's like, oh yeah, we're part of the exclusive members club because it's more, it's what it says about you. And then in some cases it's maybe how you feel, how you feel about yourself. It's like, yeah, I feel good when I wear these clothes. And a lot of that comes from, this idea of tribalism. And I think a lot of people say, I don't get influenced by marketing. Oh, 100% everyone gets influenced by marketing. There's no question about it. They can say they're not influenced by it, but they are 100%. It's just they don't notice it because marketing now is so good that, it's those small nudges over a long period of time that you're like, you know what? I'm going to buy this Lumen lotion. Like, I don't know if you've seen that ad on Instagram. Like I bought it. I don't even know why. Like, I'm like, what am I doing with Lumen lotion in my house? But it's just ads. They're just pretty good, and you eventually give into it.
Based on what you've said and a little bit of Seth Godin's got a really good book called Tribes. It seems like to create a brand or create that kind of tribe or movement, you need to be clear on what you stand against. So I think it's really common to see it a lot in diet culture at the moment with like veganism or carnivore only diets. It's very clear that you are standing against the status quo, standing against this group, and you're doing something radically different. The gleaning that I seem to be taking at the moment is that if you do want to have that kind of tribal or it factor with your company, you do need to project like not only what you are and what you stand for, but there needs to be something about, hey, we're against this, or like, we are different to these people. We are an exclusive club. So do you think that's like a fair comment that if you want to make something cool, you need to be really clear about what you're not?
Absolutely. I think that if you want to pierce through the noise, you have to be controversial, not in a traditionally controversial sense, but in a way that you have to say, we're against this particular thing. Apple is very famously pro privacy, right? That's like one of their main things. Like, oh, we make sure that we protect our users, but they're also very against openness, so Apple products are not open. They're not integratable into other things. They control everything. You control the Apple ecosystem. In fact, if you ever used AirPods with an Android phone, you'll notice that it just doesn't work. They've made it a point to be not open. And I think that's a very controversial view to take, especially in technology where there's a big open source culture. So, there are people for that very reason that don't like Apple. But I think in a similar vein, that stance also is what separates them from the others.
I want to touch on parts of your story, but in particular, what you learned throughout your time in terms of building and maintaining relationships. Do you have any high-level thoughts there?
I think anyone who approaches relationships in a transactional way will find that they have very few of them. Relationships are like flowers, right? Like you need to, feed them, you need to take care of them, and you need to approach them with care, but you need to approach them with a selflessness that I think often people don't approach them with. So they often go into a relationship in a very self-serving way. I think the only self-serving way that actually works is if you self-serve them. So if you serve them in a way that benefits them and you. So one of the things that I always do when I'm meeting somebody new is, instead of thinking, oh, how could this person help me? I always think, how can I help this person? Who can I connect them with where they would find value? And then at that moment, if I've connected them with someone that they find value with, especially if this person is somebody that, let's say, is sought after a lot, they get lots of requests, they get lots of people asking them for stuff. And let's say a famous person, you meet a famous person and, they're used to people asking them for stuff. Can I get a photo? Can you like tweet about me or something like that? How do you sort of put yourself on a level with that? How do you build a relationship with that person? And I think the way that I find you build a relationship with a person like that, or anyone for that matter, is to think, how can I help this person? Who can I connect them with that they don't already know, that they would really have value from meeting? And when you do that, suddenly you elevate yourself as well, because, you're helping them, you've created value, and now, they see you as somebody that, isn't in it for personal gain. You could argue that that's the ultimate personal gain move, but I think that's one thing that I've found really helpful. The second thing I think is something I've noticed by, again, people who are in the public eye a lot. And I think, it's not even in the public eye. People like you're very good at this. The conversation is very balanced and they ask a lot of questions. So next time you're in a conversation with somebody, just try to keep track of the number of times they've asked you a question. And you'll notice that majority of people do not ask you questions about yourself. People are concerned about themselves, You'll speak to them, you'll be like, hey, how are you? Oh, good, good. They might ask you, okay, fine. But then after that, it's very much on them. You ask them questions. You could keep the person talking forever and they would never think for a second, hey, let me ask you a question. Let me turn the tables on you and make you the subject of the conversation. And when I've seen people that do that, I suddenly feel very close to them. The people who ask me questions, like right now, I'm feeling very close to you because you keep asking me questions, but I get that's the nature of this conversation. But, when people ask you questions and you share a little bit about yourself, you're giving them a piece of yourself. You're sharing a piece of yourself with them, and then vice versa when they speak to you. So I think that is the one thing that I've noticed works very well in any circumstance. Whether you're speaking to somebody for the first time, whether you're in a networking hall and you're like meeting loads of different new people, or whether you're like approaching somebody, who you admire, having the ability to ask good questions is what really differentiates you from the rest, and something that people I know notice.
This is a bit of a disjointed thought, but I think the two ideas link somewhat together. And so I met you at Imran's barbecue, which was full of really sort of people who've, in my eyes, made it and done really well in different aspects of their careers. And one commonality, and maybe it was because it was a self-selecting group, but it seemed to be that the people who were there, who had, in my eyes, made it, all seem to be getting into content now, or a lot of them seem to be making some kind of content play, whether that's starting like a YouTube channel, writing, making a podcast, etc. And I find that very confusing because for me, making content is kind of my play to make it. You know what I mean? So it seems weird. So what I just wanted to ask you from like your perspective, and maybe the perspective of your friends and colleagues and things, is like, why is that happening? Why are people getting into content?
I think there's a sense of building a brand, so everyone wants to build a brand because we discussed earlier, there are relationships between brands and tribes. So lots of people who are doing content now, like, okay, I can speak to my own motivations. I constantly shifted my content. I started off making content about education and AI, because that's something I knew about. Then I like shifted to like comedy videos, realized that wasn't that funny. Then like shifted to now I'm focused on fashion. I'm focused on, a space that my friends would never read. Like my immediate circle of friends would never read my content. It's super niche. And the reason I'm doing that is because it enables me to have interesting conversations and further my own understanding. But also, I'm building a new product. I'm building a new business now, which is like, upstream supply chain. And having content is really the best way for me to have a soft sales channel. So there is like a self-serving motive there. When you are recognizable, like when you're recognizable in the public eye, or you're recognized, not in the public eye in the general sense, like, oh, I'm a famous celebrity, but rather in the context of your industry or your niche, if you're recognized in that space, then doors open for you in ways that you can't expect. Let me draw a parallel that might make more sense. If you're an academic, there's a famous saying, publish or perish, right? Academics are content creators. They're forced to publish papers, because if you don't publish papers, do you even exist? Are you even an academic? So they were the original content creators. And, there's some level of credibility around what they produce. And the professors that produce, the most number of papers and have the most number of citations, which you can say are views, have the most authority in the industry and the most authority in their field. So in a similar vein, I don't think, this is an entirely new model. It's something that's been sort of, replicated in previous industries, which is happening now. So like now, instead of writing academic papers, I very much have this experience. I was an academic. I'm still an academic technically. Instead of publishing academic papers, I want to publish papers for my niche, which is, in the form of a Substack post, in the form of a YouTube video or a tweet. It's my version or our version of academic papers.
I wanted to talk a little bit about your general mission and finding purpose and things. Your story is interesting because you've pivoted in so many different fields, and I don't know if you've found that purpose or you're still finding that purpose. But yeah, can you talk a bit to that?
I always felt like I came here by luck. I got to this point here by luck, because there are days that I don't like what I do, but generally I love what I do. I enjoy what I do. I wake up in the morning thinking, like most days, there's many days that I don't, thinking like, I feel ambitious about this. I feel enthusiastic about what I'm doing. But lots of people are still searching for that. Right. And I think whilst I got here by luck, I think that you can engineer this pathway for lots of other people. And a large part of that has to do with exposure. So, when I was growing up, I only knew doctors. So I never knew any other careers other than medicine. That should not happen. That is a fundamental, engineering or curriculum design problem, or just a general society problem where kids are not exposed to, what happens when you lose structure in your life. Not in a bad way. Like, until you're in university, you have structure in your life, right? You know what's going to happen the next year. When you're in second grade, you're going to go into third grade. When you're in third grade, you're going to go into fourth grade. When you're in the first year of university, you're going to go into second year university. The good thing about medicine is that you continue to know the structure, right? Oh yeah, I do my F1, my F2, my CT, etc. But if you're not in medicine, there is no structured pathway. And that's where people lose. That's where people get lost. And one of my missions right now is that I think that lost is a function of lack of exposure and lack of guidance, and particularly lack of guidance with people who have, for demographical or ethnic reasons, a limitation in exposure, particularly Muslims in Britain, who are not necessarily in the most privileged portions of society, who very frequently lack exposure to opportunities. Even if they wanted to take those, they don't know what they don't know. So one of my missions has been encouraging people to have the audacity to dream. And that's in two folds, right? One is in the form of education. Now, I'm not somebody who thinks everyone needs to go to higher education. I actually think that's not necessarily helpful. What I won't say, though, is that it's not useful. I think that in the society we live in, unfortunately, what university you go to unfortunately does matter. It shouldn't be that way, but it does matter. But the other end of the spectrum is entrepreneurship, where the rooms that I sit in, the people that I meet, not many of them look like me or come from backgrounds like myself. It's growing, no doubt. The number of brown Muslims in Britain starting companies is growing. but it's still very much in the minority. We're still, if someone, in Bradford thinks of a business idea, it's going to be a shisha shop for sure, or a burger joint, not to say that there aren't people great. I have two great friends from Bradford who are doing incredible stuff. One of them is like, one of the early employees at Spotify. But the general case is that, there is a lack of exposure. And it's my personal, it's part of my mission, I feel, to be part of the conversation, the influence that helps people from our background to, explore less conventional careers.
Can I ask how much, and look, this is going to sound a bit rude, but how much of your purpose, if you had to put a percentage on it, do you think is about the superficial things, like just making cash? Like what would you ascribe to that?
On an average day, probably like 90%, on an average day, probably 90%. You're thinking, yeah, it'd be great to sell my business and make a few $100 million. But then you have those days where you have a holistic view of life. When you consider the fact that people die, death is a thing. We're mortal. We're not going to be here forever. That, this is something that really hit home with me. Someone asked me like, how old are your parents? I was like, my dad is, in his late 60s. He's like, okay, how many times a year do you see them? And I was like, I go to, Saudi and now Pakistan once a year. He's like, okay, cool. So you're probably going to see your parents, like your dad, 14 more times. And I was like, that is messed up. That is a very messed up thing to think about. Like, I'm spending my time here trying to build a business, thinking to myself, like, this is what needs to happen. Like, I'm chasing this like money or like material gain. When everyone in their mom knows that what makes you happy in life is your relationships. That's the true route to happiness. There's no question about it. There's no debate about it. That's what makes you happy. Sure, at a certain point, like if you're like in poverty, sure, money will make you a little bit happier. But once you're at a certain level, it's not going to contribute to your long-term happiness. And I think that when those days that I remember that, then my purpose is the other 10%, But yeah, that's definitely a good question.
The last thing I wanted to ask was, have there been any books, resources, anything else that you found particularly useful, either recently or throughout your journey?
The obvious ones, of course, the ones that influenced me for sure, is the 4-Hour Workweek. There's also another book that's less popular. Let me try to find it. Yeah, it's called Super Business, How I Started Super Jam from My Grand's Kitchen. Fraser Daughtry. Really, really practical book that isn't like, it's not rhetoric. It's like very practical, step by step, like, this is what I did. This is what I did. And I really resonated with that, because often you get books that are great to read, really interesting stories about people's journey throughout their career. His book, very similar to Tim Ferriss, is like practical, like, hey, this is what you should do. This is what you should do. And I feel like often that's what we're looking for. We're looking for someone to tell us what to do instead of us having to read somebody's journey and lessons learned and try to contextualize that into our own life. There's a little element of extra work that you have to do. What I liked about this read was that, like, it's called, again, Super Business by Fraser Daughtry. You don't need to think. It tells you what to do. And like, as a lazy man, I really prefer that.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. You can find all my links by going to bigpicturemedicine.co.uk. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, then please consider leaving a review. And by the way, all of these episodes are now available on Spotify and on YouTube in video format. Thanks for listening.